The alarm tore through the station before I even opened my eyes that morning, and within 3 seconds I was on my feet, pulling on my boots, my heart already pounding harder than it should for 6 in the morning. Red light pulsed along every wall. A calm computer voice repeated the same warning over and over, telling everyone that the core stabilizer had suffered a critical failure, and that all personnel should proceed to their emergency stations immediately. I did not need to be told twice. My name is Nathan, and I was the lead systems engineer on Halcyon Station, a small outpost built on the edge of nowhere for one single purpose: to host the first peace talks between Earth and the Veil Compact after 3 long years of conflict. Every soul on this station, human and Veil alike, was here, because both sides had finally agreed to stop fighting long enough to talk. If the station failed now, that fragile agreement failed with it, and both fleets waiting just beyond the border would have every reason to start again. I sprinted down the corridor, dodging crew members running the opposite way, my mind already racing through the layout of the coolant systems. The core stabilizer kept the station's shield active, the same shield that kept both delegations safe from the harsh radiation outside, and, more importantly, kept the peace talks from collapsing into panic. Lose the shield, and we would lose everything we had worked months to build. Halfway down the main corridor, I hit a wall of people bunched up near a sealed bulkhead door, its control panel flashing a stubborn red light instead of opening. A junior technician was slapping the panel with the flat of his hand, shouting at it as though that would help. I pushed through, pulled the maintenance hatch beside the door, and yanked 2 wires free before crossing them together. The door groaned, hesitated, then finally slid open just wide enough for people to squeeze through one at a time. I did not wait to be thanked. I was already moving again, counting the seconds in my head the way I had been trained to do since my first year on this job. A voice crackled through my earpiece. It was Grace, my supervisor, shouting over the noise of her own corridor. She told me the coolant junction near Deck 4 had ruptured, and unless someone rerouted power manually within the next 15 minutes, the core would overheat and shut down every system on the station, including life support for 300 people. 15 minutes. I could work with 15 minutes. I had trained for far worse than this. There is something else, Grace added, her voice dropping slightly even through the static. The Veil fleet outside the border has gone quiet. No response to our hailing signals since the alarm started. If this station goes dark, they may assume the worst and act before anyone can explain what really happened. That single sentence changed everything about how I understood the next 15 minutes. This was not simply a matter of saving 300 lives on board. If the shield failed and the station appeared to fall silent, an entire fleet on edge after 3 years of fighting might decide that the ceasefire had already been broken, and there would be no time for anyone to convince them otherwise. I turned a corner sharply and nearly ran straight into an evacuating crowd, engineers and diplomats alike moving in one confused wave toward the escape pods. Nobody stopped me. Nobody even looked at me twice. I was just another person running toward danger while everyone else ran away from it, which, if I am honest, is most of what my job actually is. The deeper I went into the maintenance section, the quieter it became. The crowds thinned out until I was alone in a narrow service corridor, lit only by flickering emergency strips, each one buzzing faintly like it was struggling to stay lit. I could hear the low groan of the station itself, metal complaining under stress it was never meant to handle. That is when I heard the crying. It was small and frightened, coming from a side passage that led to an old storage bay, one that should have been empty and sealed. I almost kept running. Every second mattered, and I knew it. But something about that sound stopped me cold. The kind of sound no person can simply walk past, no matter how tight the clock is. I turned into the passage and found her sitting on the floor, knees pulled up to her chest, eyes wide and wet. She was Veil, small even for her own kind, dressed in a formal little outfit clearly meant for the peace talks rather than an emergency. Her skin held that soft blue-gray shine I had only seen from a distance before, and all 4 of her eyes were fixed on me the moment I stepped into view. In her arms she held something small and metallic, a little rounded shell with thin crystal legs that should have been glowing and were instead completely dark and still. "Are you hurt?" I asked, crouching down slowly, keeping my hands visible and my voice as steady as I could manage with the clock ticking loudly in the back of my mind. She shook her head, but her chin trembled anyway. "Everyone left," she said, her words slightly delayed through the small translator device clipped near her collar. "The alarm came, and everyone ran, and I could not find my guardian, and Ren stopped working when I fell." Ren, she said the name like it belonged to a person, not an object, and looking at the little device in her arms, I understood why. It was clearly her companion, something built to comfort her during a summit that must have felt impossibly large and frightening for a child her age. I glanced at the corridor behind me, picturing the countdown running somewhere on a screen I could not see. 12 minutes now, maybe less. Every instinct told me to keep moving, to trust that someone else would find her, that my job was the reactor, not a crying child in a storage bay. But nobody else was coming. The corridor was empty, and she was still crying, and I could not make myself leave. "Let me see," I said, holding out my hand. She hesitated only a moment, before placing the small device in my palms. It was warmer than I expected, almost like it was still trying to hold on to whatever life it had left. I turned it over and found a hairline crack running along its underside, right where a thin crystal thread connected two halves of the shell. That thread, I guessed, carried whatever current kept the little creature alive and glowing. "Can you fix her?" the girl asked, her voice barely above a whisper, watching my face closely, as though the answer mattered more than anything else in the universe right then. "I am going to try," I said honestly, because I did not want to promise something I could not be sure of. I have never worked on anything quite like her before, but broken things usually want the same thing, no matter where they come from. They just need someone to look closely enough to see what went wrong. She nodded slowly, though I could tell she did not fully understand what I meant. She simply trusted that I meant it kindly, and in that moment, that seemed to be enough for her. I did not have the right parts. I had never even worked on Veil technology before, only human systems, but broken is broken no matter which star it was built under, and I had spent years learning how to make things work with whatever was on hand. I pulled a thin strand of wire from my tool belt and looped it carefully across the crack, testing the tension before pressing the seam closed. For a moment nothing happened, and I felt my chest tighten with worry that I had made things worse instead of better. Then the crystal legs flickered. A soft amber light spread slowly across them, hesitant at first, then steady, and a low gentle hum rose from the little shell as though it had just woken from a long and troubled sleep. The girl gasped and snatched it back into her arms, holding it against her chest while it curled its thin legs gently around her wrist. "You fixed her," she whispered, staring at me like I had done something impossible. "Field repair," I said, standing up and already thinking about the corridor ahead of me. "She will need a proper fix later, but she should hold until then." The girl looked up at me, and before I could say another word, she crossed the small space between us and wrapped both arms tightly around my waist. I froze completely. Every briefing I had sat through about Veil customs had said the same thing, that physical contact between strangers was treated as an enormous gesture, almost a formal declaration, never something done lightly or by accident. I had no idea what to do with my hands, so I simply held them slightly away from my sides and let her hug me without pulling back. Footsteps thundered into the passage behind us, heavy and urgent. Two Veil guards in ceremonial armor skidded to a stop in the doorway, and I watched their faces shift from alarm to something close to disbelief as they took in the sight in front of them. One of them stepped forward quickly, speaking in sharp-clipped Veil that my translator struggled to catch in full. "It is all right," I said quickly, raising my hand slightly. She came to me. Her toy stopped working. I only fixed it. The girl finally let go and turned to face the guards, standing a little taller than she had been a moment before, as though remembering something important about herself. "I am Scielvira, third daughter of the vessel mother of House Kest," she said, her small voice suddenly formal and clear. "This human repaired Ren without being asked. I owe him a debt, and I will not forget it." The guards went very still. I did not fully understand the weight behind her words yet, but I understood enough to know that House Kest was not an ordinary name. It belonged to the very delegation leading the peace talks upstairs, the same vessel mother who was, at that very moment, likely deciding whether humanity could be trusted at all. One of the guards finally lowered his head slightly, a gesture I had seen before in the briefings, something reserved for moments of genuine respect rather than routine politeness. "The vessel mother has searched every deck for her daughter since the alarm began," he said, his translated voice unusually careful. "We were told to report back the moment she was found, regardless of the circumstances. Then you should go," I said, glancing again at the corridor stretching out behind me. "She needs to know her daughter is safe, and I need to get back to work before this station stops being safe for anyone." The girl looked between the guards and me, her small hand tightening briefly around Ren before she let the guard lift her gently into his arms. My earpiece crackled sharply before I could process any of it. Grace's voice came through, tight with urgency. "Nathan, where are you? We are down to 8 minutes. I need you at the junction now." 8 minutes. I looked at Scielvira, then at the guards, then back down the corridor where I still had to run. "Get her somewhere safe," I told the guards, already turning to leave. "I have to go." One of the guards nodded and scooped the girl up gently, her small arms wrapping around the guard's shoulder while she twisted back to look at me. "Thank you," she called out, her voice carrying down the corridor as I ran. I did not have time to answer. I sprinted the rest of the way through the maintenance section, following the map in my head until I reached the junction, a narrow crawl space filled with pipes and cables, sparks spitting from a ruptured coupling near the ceiling. Grace was already there, kneeling beside an open panel, sweat on her forehead despite the cold air rushing through the broken vent. 6 minutes, she said without looking up. "The manual override is jammed. I cannot force it alone." I dropped beside her and pulled the panel wider, my hands moving faster than my thoughts, muscle memory taking over where fear tried to creep in. Wires crossed in a tangled mess in front of me, half of them scorched, one of them sparking dangerously close to a coolant line that, if it ruptured, would flood the section in freezing gas within seconds. I found the override lever, bent slightly out of shape from the earlier rupture, and threw my whole weight against it. It gave half an inch before jamming again. 5 minutes, Grace said, her voice tighter now. "The secondary line just failed. We have no backup path left. This lever is the only way through." I braced both hands against the frame and pulled once more, feeling the metal bite into my palms. It refused to move any further, locked tight by whatever damage the rupture had caused deeper inside the mechanism. Grace shoved a length of pipe into my hands, something she had pulled from a broken shelf nearby, and I jammed it against the lever for extra leverage. "On 3, I said, and we both pulled together, our combined weight finally forcing the lever another few inches. Sparks showered down around us from a loose connector overhead, and for one heartbeat I thought the whole junction might give out completely. 4 minutes, Grace said, her voice tighter now. I braced my foot against the frame of the crawl space and pulled again, ignoring the sharp edge biting into my palm, ignoring everything except the lever in front of me. It groaned, resisted, then finally snapped free with a loud crack that echoed down the narrow space. Power surged through the junction with a deep mechanical roar, and for one terrifying second the lights around us dimmed completely, plunging the crawl space into total darkness. Then, slowly, the emergency strips flickered back to life, steady this time, no longer buzzing. 2 minutes and holding, Grace said, staring at the small display built into the panel. Core temperature dropping. We did it. I sat back against the cold metal wall, my chest heaving, my hands trembling slightly from the adrenaline still rushing through me. Somewhere above us, the alarm finally cut off, replaced by the same calm computer voice announcing that the emergency had passed and all personnel could return to their regular duties. I do not remember exactly how long I sat there before I finally climbed out of that crawl space, but by the time I reached the main deck, the corridors were full again, crew members and diplomats alike moving calmly, relief written plainly across every face. A few people I passed nodded at me without knowing exactly what I had done, simply grateful that the alarms had stopped and the lights had steadied. Grace clapped a hand on my shoulder as we walked, saying nothing at all, which somehow felt like more than enough after the last 15 minutes. Word travels fast on a small station, and by the time I reached my quarters that evening, I had already heard 2 different versions of what had happened near the coolant junction, neither of them quite accurate, both somehow more dramatic than what I remembered living through. I did not bother correcting anyone. I was simply glad to sit down, finally, and let my hands stop shaking. The following morning, Station Command confirmed that the Veil fleet outside the border had finally answered our hailing signals. Their commander told our ambassador plainly that they had watched the shield flicker and nearly vanish, and that they had come very close to treating it as a sign that the ceasefire had already failed. What stopped them, their commander explained, was a single short message sent from someone inside the Veil delegation itself, asking for patience a little longer. I later learned that the message had come from the vessel mother of House Kest, sent within minutes of her daughter returning safely to the delegation deck. 3 days later, the peace accord was signed. I was not in the room when it happened. I was 3 decks down, replacing a burnt coupling, same as always, when Grace found me and told me the news. She said the vessel mother of House Kest had opened the final session by telling both delegations that she had reconsidered certain assumptions about humanity, based on something her own daughter had witnessed during the emergency. I did not need to ask which moment she meant. Grace told me later that the vessel mother had described the story in careful detail to the entire chamber, how a human engineer, racing against a countdown that threatened the lives of everyone on board, had still chosen to stop for a frightened child he did not know and owed nothing to. She said it had struck a chord with delegates on both sides of the table, people who had spent 3 years believing the worst about each other, and had needed exactly one small, simple act to begin believing something different. Elvira found me later that same week, standing quietly at the edge of the observation deck, with Ren curled happily around her wrist, glowing a steady warm amber. She told me that her mother had asked her, again and again, to describe exactly what she saw that day, and each time she told the story the same way, that a human had stopped running from danger long enough to fix something small and broken, without asking who she was or what it might cost him. She also told me something I had not expected to hear. On the day of the emergency, her guardian had been caught on the far side of the sealed bulkhead door I had forced open earlier that morning, unable to reach her in time. If that door had stayed closed even a few minutes longer, she said, she would have wandered even further from anyone who might have found her before the shield failed completely. It was strange to think that fixing a stuck door on my way to the reactor had mattered just as much as anything I did afterward, even though at the time it had felt like nothing more than a small delay. Word of the emergency spread quickly through both delegations, and in the days that followed, a few of the Vale engineers asked to see how I had repaired Ren, curious about the simple wire and steady hands that had solved a problem their own technology had not prepared her for. I found myself explaining, more than once, that fixing things had never felt complicated to me, only patient. Somewhere along the way, one of the older Vale engineers told me that patience, more than any weapon or any speech, was the one thing his people had never expected to find in a human. I never expected first contact to feel like fixing a toy for a frightened child in the middle of an emergency. I certainly never expected it to end a war that had lasted 3 long years. But I have learned since then that peace rarely begins in grand rooms filled with important people making important speeches. More often, it begins somewhere much smaller and much quieter, in a narrow corridor, with someone willing to stop, kneel down, and ask if they can help. Say Elvira still sends me messages sometimes, short and cheerful, mostly updates about Ren, who apparently now lights up every time my name is mentioned nearby. I keep every single one of those messages, because they remind me that the biggest moments in life rarely announce themselves in advance. Sometimes they simply sound like a child crying in an empty corridor, waiting for someone to notice.